People use Bitcoin as a speculative asset, right? It's like gold. It's just like gold, only it's virtual. It's digital.
Let me ask you a slightly different question about crypto. We were talking earlier also about Bitcoin, and it's going, it's rising. There's talk in Washington also about creating a Bitcoin reserve, actually. You do deal with currencies to some degree, and you have to think about some of these issues. How does crypto sit with you right now at a time when it appears that this next administration may legalize it in a much more broader way? I mean, it's legal now, but that there might be a much bigger groundswell for it.
So from the jobs that we have, what's relevant is really two things. One is just, what role should crypto assets be allowed to play in the banking system? We try to keep the banking system safe and sound. We regulate and supervise banks, and we would want the interaction between the crypto business and the banks to not to threaten the health and well-being of the banks. That's thing one. The other one just is, to the extent anybody's doing that through a bank, we would want the public to, if people are buying crypto products and things like that, there's sort of a consumer protection aspect of it. But they should need to understand exactly what it is and that sort of thing. But we're not, we don't regulate it directly, and we don't have that big of a role.
Would you ever own it yourself?
I'm not allowed to.
You're not allowed to?
No.
One of the big issues coming up is going to be taxes and the budget. We talked about DOGE and all of this. One thing that you have spoken out quite emphatically about is debt and deficits. You've been doing that now for a very, very long time. What is, in your mind, the tipping point for the debt and the deficit? In that, for a very long time, I go back to thinking of 2010 or 11. I read some of the speeches you were giving back then, and thinking about Simpson Bowles. And at that time, people talked about the debt and deficit. We're at a tipping point. If we don't deal with it immediately, we're at a knife's edge. We're going to tip over. And here we are in 2024, and we haven't tipped over yet. In between that, there was this whole MMT idea that somehow we could just spend money wildly, and that would be fine too. And I'm not sure that's gained too much traction either. Maybe it's been undone. But what do you worry about as the tipping point for all of this?
So you're right. I did work on fiscal policy issues before I came to the Fed. But at the Fed, we don't have oversight over fiscal policy. Quite to the contrary, Congress has oversight over us. So I would limit myself to saying this, that the U.S. federal budget is on an unsustainable path. The debt is not at an unsustainable level, but the path is unsustainable. And we know that we have to change that. We've got to get back so that revenues and spending are in better alignment. We don't need to pay the debt down. We don't need to balance the budget. We just need the economy to grow faster than the debt, and that's not happening. We're running very large budget deficits at a time of full employment and strong growth. So we need to address that, and we got to do it sooner or later, and sooner is better than later.
Now, do you think the Fed should or could take into account the debt and deficits and that cost in terms of where you think rates can or should be ever?
No, never. I mean, if the central bank, this is you see this in some emerging market countries, for example. If the central bank can't raise rates to deal with inflation because the fiscal situation is so bad that they can't raise rates, that's called fiscal dominance, and that we're so far from that. I mean, we will always use I put it this way, we'll always use our tools to achieve price stability and maximum employment, 2% inflation. We're not thinking about, we better not raise rates because of the budget. If we ever get to that point, that we're far from that point.
Right. Before I forget, one of the reasons I wanted to actually ask you about Bitcoin is, to some degree, people think that is a symbol of people's faith or lack of faith in either the U.S. dollar or in the Federal Reserve itself, in terms of the system. What do you think of that idea?
I don't think that's how people think about it. I mean, it's so, people use Bitcoin as a speculative asset, right? It's like gold. It's just like gold, only it's virtual. It's digital. People are not using it as a form of payment or as a store of value. It's highly volatile. It's not a competitor for the dollar. It's really a competitor for gold. That's really how I think of it.
When you think about other countries, and I know it's not your job necessarily to think about other countries, but you spend a lot of time, I think, talking to your peers at other central banks. What are you most concerned about? Are you most concerned about the economy in China right now? Are you most concerned about Europe? Take us around the world.
They're as good as things are in the United States, of course, there are always risks. And certainly geopolitical risk is very elevated around the world with Ukraine and the Middle East and, kind of very weak growth in places like China. That's all out there. I think domestically, we do see low and moderate income people under some economic pressure. If you read, for example, or listen to the earnings reports from some of the retailers who deal a lot with low and moderate income people, they will uniformly say that people are under pressure. They're very much price shopping and that kind of thing. So that's the aggregate numbers for the U.S. are really good, but we see pressures there in the lower income spectrum that we didn't see 2 years ago after the pandemic when people came out with really significant amounts of savings.
One of the, when we came up, and I don't know if you got a chance to see the video, we were talking, one of the big things was vibe session, this idea of how people think, the vibe about the economy. And I think the vibe had a lot to do with actually the result of the election. And I'm curious how you think about this question, about inflation. A lot of people were saying, well, it is this past administration's fault, the inflation problem. Some people said it was your fault. Some people said it was how much money Congress appropriated during the period of COVID. How do you actually think about it yourself?
Look, we shut down the world economy partially, and there was a global outburst of inflation. There was a time when there wasn't a single country in the world that had 2% inflation. It was everywhere, okay? And what was it because? It was because of a lot of pent-up demand. It was certainly because of very strong fiscal support and low rates. Right. All of those things contributed to inflation everywhere. And now it's, if you look at, I could show you a graph of 10 countries, and they all look like that. And I'd say, which one is the United States? You wouldn't be able to, you'd have a 1 in 10 chance of guessing. So I think that's what happened. And, the good news is, in the case of the United States, we're back to a much better place. But I will say, people are unhappy because the price level is higher. Right. You can tell people that inflation has gone down, which is the change in prices, but that doesn't matter to people who are paying, 10, 20% more for the important things in their lives.